With Devarim Perek 26, we conclude Moshe's second address to the nation. And in the final pasukim of this segment, Moshe restates the fact that Bnei Israel had accepted God and the belief in monotheism that God demanded, and in return, God had selected Bnei Israel as his chosen nation to be an Am Kadosh, and in modern terminology, an Or LaGoyim. There are two other segments in this perek, both thematically connected. The first is the declaration that needs to be made when one presents the Bikurim, the first fruits, to the Kohen in the Mikdash area, and a second is a declaration that the person makes upon the final removal of any Ma'aser from the private living space of the individual in year 3 and 6 of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. We will shortly look at a piece from Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who plumbs the depth as to why these two declarations were selected as the concluding segment of Moshe's second and by far the lengthiest speech to the nation. With respect to the mitzvah of Bikurim, the text opens with some information regarding the Bikurim process, namely that the individual arrives with the Bikurim and makes an affirmation to the Kohen on duty that he or she has arrived in the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has promised to the Avot, which would suggest that in addition to an expression of thankfulness for the prosperity that the individual receives for a successful harvest, there is an additional aspect to Mitzvat Bikurim, namely the continued affirmation of the fulfillment of God's promise to the Avot. Kohen then receives the basket containing the Bikurim and places it in front of the Mizbeach, following which the individual makes a declaration. And in this declaration, which according to many authorities must be made in this format, and in fact in Hebrew, that Arami Oved Avi, referring to Avraham, where for whatever the reason the descendants of Avraham were forced to resettle in Egypt, endure a form of slavery. God interceded, took them out of Egypt in fulfillment of promises that were made to the Avot, the forefathers, and therefore the presentation of the Bikurim, fruits that come from the promised land, is to be considered testimony to the fulfillment of that commitment. Undoubtedly, this segment of Arami Oved Avi, the declaration, should be familiar to us all, in that a very large section of Haggadah real estate is devoted to providing medrashic interpretation to these pasukim in Devarim Perek Chaf Vav. The focus of the Sikha relates to the content of the declaration, in which the individual presenting the Bikurim takes note of two historical events. The first, Yaakov's escape from Lavan Ha'arami, and the second, the intercession of God in saving the Bnei Israel from Paro in Mitzrayim. Following the placement of the Bikurim by the Kohen Gadol alongside the Mizbeach, we have the declaration, which is recorded in Devarim 26, 5-11, made by those who have brought the Bikurim to the Mishkan, and in later times to Yerushalayim. In that declaration, a number of points are made. Firstly, Arami Oved Avi, a rescue from the threat of annihilation from the Arami. The Arami referred to in this pasuk is Lavan, the Avi, Yaakov Avinu, and that Yaakov was able to escape annihilation at the hands of Lavan. Eventually, Yaakov and his family resettled in Mitzrayim, and thus began the period of enslavement in fulfillment of the conditions of the Brit Ben HaBetarim. The details of that enslavement are recorded in Sefer Shmot. It was brutal, to the point that the people eventually turned in prayer to God, and Hashem takes note and acts upon the collective request of the nation. The person making the declaration goes on to state that through the Yad Chazakah, the Zroya Netuya, the Mora Gadol, Otot Moftim, there was an exodus from Mitzrayim, and 40 years later the nation entered Eretz Yisrael, the land that was Zavat Chalav U'Dvash, flowing with milk and honey. And hence the entire process of the bringing of Bikurim is an expression of thankfulness to God in fulfilling the conditions of the Brit Ben HaBetarim that was made to Avraham Avinu many generations earlier. There is also an acknowledgement of God's intervention in facilitating their arrival into Eretz Israel, his intercession in averting a situation of near annihilation, firstly at the hands of Lavan, and secondly at the hands of the Paro of the day in Mitzrayim. This, in a nutshell, is the context in which Mitzvat Bikurim was to be fulfilled. You have the act of Bikurim along with its symbolism, an acknowledgement of God's intervention that facilitated the nation's arrival into Eretz Israel and a successful resettlement in that land.